In Alaska, the race is on as mushers forge ahead in the Iditarod. But maybe the time has come to end it all. Once a symbol of humanity, the race is now notorious for being a brutal display of animal cruelty. Stopping the Iditarod. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, more than 150 dogs have died in the modern history of the Iditarod. And that 150, well, that's just the deaths that get reported.
That number doesn't count the number of dogs who died while in training, off the trail while they were chained up outside. And we've gotten reports from whistleblowers who have come forward who have said they have seen dogs being killed because they were no longer considered profitable. A veteran musher came forward and revealed that trainers of dogs used to pull these sleds have killed, in her words, hundreds on top of hundreds or more dogs because they didn't make the cut. Others who have come forward and said they've seen mushers, quote, beating the hell out of one of the dogs.
Colleen O'Brien, VP of Communications for PETA, talks to the whistleblowers who have reported the brutality associated with the Iditarod, the most famous sled dog race in the world. It hasn't been enough to shut down the 47th running of the big race, but there are signs that activism is having an impact. That's next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. This is episode 58 in our second season of shows. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. This is about dog racing, this particular episode, but PETA is making an impact in another area of animal exploitation. Horse racing. After a 21st horse died at California's Santa Anita racetrack since December of last year, it was PETA's horse racing department that convinced track management to consider the animal's plight and shut down the track until further notice. We'll have a special extra PETA podcast on horse racing coming up. In the meantime, if you've just found us, welcome, and keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. Still wondering about your Canada Goose jacket? You can ditch it and stay warm and vegan. Listen to episode 44. And for more on animal testing, listen how scientists have turned it into their own welfare system in episode 11. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. There's also a link to a survey in our show notes. If you're so inclined, please fill it out. We'd love to hear your feedback. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. The Iditarod is a 1,000-mile race over mountains, frozen rivers, and icy coastal terrain. Historically, it was a race to get medicine to faraway areas. But in the last 47 years, it's become all about the mushing and the money. But since PETA's been actively protesting, the prize money has dwindled to about $250,000 less than it was in 2017. Sponsors are pulling out. The 52 teams entered in the race is the smallest in 2 decades. There's a sense that activists could be close to winning for the dog's sake. Here's my conversation with PETA's Colleen O'Brien on the PETA Podcast. So let's talk about this, Colleen, because you're the Iditarod expert, and we talked last year about the Iditarod. The race is taking place right now in Alaska. Take us through the basics again about briefly about what the race is all about.
Sure. Well, the Iditarod, as you said, it started on Saturday, and it's a race in Alaska in which mushers compete for prize money by forcing teams of dogs to run up to 100 miles a day for about 10 days or more through freezing cold, snowstorms, treacherous ice, sub-zero temperatures. And winning the Iditarod is really just about bragging rights and a cash prize for the mushers. But for the dogs, it's a grueling race that leads to their paws being worn down, bloody. They become desperately sick with infections. Many pull muscles, incur stress fractures. And actually, the number one cause of dog deaths in the Iditarod is them choking on their own vomit. So it's a grueling, nasty race for these dogs.
Let me just go over that one thing you said, that it's just about bragging rights for the mushers. And by the mushers, you mean the humans, right?
That's right. The human mushers on the teams, it's really interesting. These are people who they sleep while these dogs are being forced to pull their sleds. And it's bragging rights for them, but for the dogs, it's deadly.
Don't the dogs, if they win, don't they become heralded as a champion? And don't they become special legends, of their own as dog champions?
Right. Well, those are things that mean nothing to dogs. These dogs who are forced to run, they're no different from the dogs we share our homes with. So what they want and what they need is loving homes, to be indoors. When these dogs aren't running, they're chained up outside like old bicycles through all weather extremes. They run in circle out of complete boredom. Bragging rights mean nothing to these dogs. What they need are loving homes.
But don't the dogs get training for this? I mean, if you talk to the mushers, they'll say that this is a big deal for the dogs because they live for this. This is their life. They want to be the champion. No? Isn't that how it works?
No, absolutely not. I mean, we know that, yes, there's training involved, but no dog would choose to run 100 miles a day for up to 10 days until their paws are so bloody and worn out and they are desperately sick. And these dogs know that they need to keep running or else they will be hit, they will be beaten. We've had whistleblowers come forward and tell us they have witnessed these beatings.
But don't they get a break, drive them into the ground? I mean, that would be counterproductive for the mushers. Don't they give these dogs a break and have they switch teams of dogs?
Well, the mushers start out with around 14 dogs, and they must finish with at least 5. We know that last year, 350 dogs were pulled out of the race, likely because of exhaustion, illness, injuries. And one of them, a dog named Blonde, died from choking on his own vomit, which, as I mentioned, is the leading cause of death for these dogs.
Because what, they're so exhausted and nauseated, or what happened?
They're overexerted. It causes fatigue and exhaustion. It suppresses their immune system. It makes them susceptible to viral or bacterial pneumonia. I mean, they are just stressed beyond the point of being able to recover from this. We've seen that dogs develop bloody diarrhea and dehydrating and vomiting, and the vomit is inhaled. It's likely due to an inflammation or an infection in their lungs.
Now, you said 150 have died throughout the history of the race?
Yes, but those are just the dogs whose deaths are reported.
So there could be more.
Absolutely, because that number doesn't count the number of dogs who died while in training, off the trail while they were chained up outside. And we've gotten reports from whistleblowers who have come forward who have said they have seen dogs being killed because they were no longer considered profitable.
But don't the mushers have a whole slew of dogs waiting to take the place of other dogs? So, I mean, they're racers. They have, their members, they have their team ready. And when, it's sort of like it's a kind of Darwinian thing, but sort of, that's what makes them maybe slightly inured to the cruelty. They have their dogs ready at the ready. What's wrong with that attitude or that that kind of outlook on the race?
I think that outlook is sort of the ultimate kind of con job that racers try to pull over on the public. Yes, these dogs are forced to run, but they are no different from the dogs we share our homes with.
Yeah. And like last year, there was one dog who died, but there were 5 who were connected to the race, or at least that's what reports say. So, and you're saying that there are all these dogs who may go unreported. Their deaths go unreported.
You know, last year, actually, a veteran musher came forward and revealed that trainers of dogs used to pull these sleds have killed, in her words, hundreds on top of hundreds or more dogs because they didn't make the cut. We've had others who have come forward and said they've seen mushers, quote, beating the hell out of one of the dogs. We've gotten reports from another whistleblower who said there was a dog who she was concerned about. The dog wasn't eating, was dehydrated, and appeared to have abdominal pain. And instead of taking this dog to the vet, giving this dog veterinary care, she watched the musher put the dog in his truck and drive out into the woods and come back without him.
And we know that the race is taking this kind of stuff seriously. I mean, there's a rule change that's being put into effect this year that if you have a dog who dies, then the musher has to be removed. How is that rule going over with the musher?
These new race rules do nothing to help the dogs. I mean, having a rule that says if a dog dies on the trail, the musher will be disqualified, this is common sense. And it took the deaths of more than 150 dogs for this change to be introduced. And furthermore, this is acknowledgement that dogs will continue to die in the Iditarod.
But at least now it says that you can't be a musher who keeps having dogs die and keep replenishing your team. You have to leave. So doesn't it make the musher a little more sensitive?
Well, it means their dogs can't die on the trail, but as we know, so many of them die off the trail.
Oh, right. So there's a distinction between dying on the trail versus, say, dying while at rest.
In training, or once the dog is dropped from the race, or in training, or like I said, chained up outside.
PETA has been protesting this race for some time. And since the last time we talked, what are the kinds of things that have happened to change things for the better for the dogs? Has the protest been successful in that regard?
Just in the last month or so, Coca-Cola has severed ties with the Iditarod, or they've told us they severed ties. They had a sponsorship through a company, and they finally confirmed after more than 205,000 emails and phone calls, they've done the right thing and severed ties with it. And they join a long list of sponsors like Wells Fargo and Jack Daniels and others who have also ended their connections and sponsorships with it.
So what is the importance of ending sponsorships? I guess that's kind of the lifeblood of the sport. It's not the dogs, it's the sponsors, right?
The mushers, they do this for a prize purse at the end. And as sponsorships decline, so does that purse. And we saw the purse decline drastically last year due to the race losing these large sponsorships. And so we're calling on everyone to contact sponsors of the Iditarod, including Chrysler, which is a sponsor through an Anchorage dealer, and calling on Alaska Airlines also to end their sponsorship as well.
The idea is if you can cut sponsorship, then it wouldn't be worthwhile for the mushers and maybe the race would die. Is that it?
And we know that the majority of the public is opposed to the Iditarod. So it's continuing to lose favor both in sponsorships and public support.
And so now the top prize for the winner is about 50,000. It's about the same as last year, but the overall amount of purses is lower. What company should the pressure be on specifically? Are there high dollar amount sponsors that you're really targeting?
Yeah, PETA's calling on everyone to contact Alaska Airlines, which is a sponsor of the Iditarod, as well as Chrysler, which is connected through a sponsorship from an Anchorage dealer. And so we're asking both of them to join the likes of Maxwell House, Pizza Hut, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Jack Daniels, and so many other companies that have severed ties with this race.
How about as far as criminal charges against mushers who may be in violation of animal treatment, or who may be animal abusers? Has there been any headway there in terms of going after the mushers?
One of the things that makes this difficult is that dogs who are forced to run in the Iditarod, even though they are, like I said earlier, they're no different from the dogs we share our homes with, but they do not get the same legal protection as our companion dogs. So we've called for investigations into dogs' deaths. After 350 dogs were pulled from the race last year, we requested copies of their medical records. So we are continuing to push in that manner, but it is more difficult because these dogs don't have the protection they need.
Now, there was one case involving four-time winner Dallas Civi. He was found, he was cleared of any wrongdoing in a 2017 dog doping scandal. Is dog doping a big deal still? I mean, apparently he was giving opioid painkillers, tramadol, to his dogs during the 2017 Iditarod. Is that still a concern to PETA's?
One thing to make clear, too, is that he's no longer being looked at by the Iditarod committee, but I wouldn't say that he was entirely cleared of it because they still don't know how that got in, who gave the drugs to the dogs. I think it's absolutely a concern that these dogs are being given medications and drugs to mask injuries and force them to run further for longer. It's very similar to what we have seen happen in the horse racing industry.
Right. So we have infirm dogs who should be arrested being made or being enabled by drugs to run when they shouldn't be. And that makes them prone to injury and breakdowns and maybe even death. So now, what is happening this year with this race? PETA is there at the Iditarod?
Yes, we are. So we're there at the Iditarod. We held a protest at the start of the race. We had a number of actually locals out protesting with us as well. And I think this kind of shows how, the Iditarod has lost favor with everyone, not just with everyone, including people who live in Alaska. We had members outside at the start of the race holding signs saying, "Stop racing dogs to death." And we had empty dog collars and harnesses that were hanging up to sort of symbolize the more than 150 dogs who've already died in the race.
But this whole thing, the Iditarod is kind of an historical event for Alaska, right? I mean, the legacy of the Iditarod is really kind of rich in Alaska lore, isn't it?
It is, but the Iditarod, what it is now is nothing at all close to what it was during the first run of these dogs. It's an entirely different beast now from what it was then, which at that time was a life-saving campaign where dogs were used to get serum for people who were deathly ill. At that time, it was a life-saving measure, and it was a relay, so the dogs were not forced to run the entire length of the trip. This is entirely different. It's strictly for fun. It's strictly for a prize for these mushers, but for the dogs, it's just running them to death.
The other thing about what you just said, though, is that in the old days, it was a relay, so you didn't wear down the dogs, and the dogs were able to stay fresh. When did it change, and why did it change, you think?
Yeah, the Iditarod, as we know it now, began in 1973, but it's entirely different from what it was then, in that these dogs are forced to run the 100 miles a day for up to 10 days, and it's a 1,000-mile trek that they're forced to run. It's entirely different from what it was back then, and it's strictly for bragging rights now.
I mean, but do you know why it changed, or do you, because it sounded like something that was basically humanitarian. How could it change so drastically, 180 degrees to where it's cruel and unusual, at least for the dog?
Yeah, it's a pretty messed up way to sort of memorialize the serum run, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
What is the hope now? PETA was there at the beginning. The race lasts till how long, and where will PETA be at the end?
the race lasts for about a week. PETA will be there at the end. We will be out there protesting, and also along with members and other locals in Alaska who are protesting with us. And we'll be keeping an eye all along the way and to the state of these dogs, how many are unfortunately likely to die during this race, and how they look when they come off the trail.
Yeah, and what is PETA doing right now while the race is going on? And what can people do while the race is going on?
We actually ran ads all along the area leading up to the race. We have beautiful bus ads that show a chained dog who looks sad. He's chained outside in the cold, chained to a plastic barrel. He looks frail, and it's an actual photo taken from a musher's lot. It's an actual photo of one of these dogs chained up outside. We're running those ads around the area, and we call on everyone to help us by never supporting sled dog operations. First of all, whether you're on vacation and you want to go for a sled dog ride, just please don't do it, because it's all inherently cruel. Please don't support the Iditarod. Tell everyone you know how these dogs suffer in this race and other races like the Yukon Quest, which is a similar dog sled race, and contact companies like Chrysler and Alaska Airlines and ask them to sever ties with the Iditarod to end their sponsorship.
Now, Colleen, do dogs survive multiple tries at the Iditarod? So do you have some veteran dogs who just ultimately grind down, or are they taken out of circulation and then allowed to rest and retire and go to a home? Or what happens to veteran dogs?
No, it's a great question. There are dogs who have run more than one race. So there are dogs who are used multiple times. There is no rule or standard in place for dogs being retired or rehomed after races. So unfortunately, there is no one looking out for these dogs after they've raced and are no longer able to race again.
I mean, because one can imagine that if you've been put through this grueling type of race, you might be okay one time, but if you do it repeatedly, it's got to take its toll, and you may not see something during the race or after the race immediately, but soon after you might see something.
These dogs are likely to develop arthritis, and as you said, just running this race one time is enough to break down so many dogs. Imagine being pushed through that multiple times. But there's no standard in place and no rule that says these dogs have to be, retired and sent to loving homes after. They can be put right back outside and chained up outside to dilapidated plastic containers.
Yeah. How about, is there any way to cut the supply of the dogs? I mean, if you can't end the race with sponsorships and that sort of thing, is there any way to cut down the number of dogs that the mushers have access to? Or is that not really an issue because dogs are plentiful? What is the situation?
Well, the dogs are bred for this purpose. And so mushers could have hundreds of dogs on their lot who they are training for this. They're bred for this purpose. The mushers can have as many dogs chained up outside as they'd like, and then they will from there choose which dogs they're going to race with. So unfortunately, there just isn't a body overseeing the welfare of these animals, because at the end of the day, this is not done for the dogs. This is done with the dogs, and the dogs are used as a money-making tool. And we see, of course, that whenever an animal is used as a money-making tool, it's inevitably the animal that loses out.
Right. And right now, the money, I mean, the top prize is 50,000. The total purse is about $500,000, but it must mean that the money making is being done by the people who are at race sites and who sell merchandise and have tourists, right? The Iditarod tourists who want to come see the race. I guess they contribute to the pot too, right?
That's a great point. That all of those things contribute to the pot. The people who volunteer, because they do rely on volunteers because of their sinking funds. So we're calling on everyone to recognize the cruelty inherent in this race, forcing these dogs to run and then forcing their lives to be so miserable when they're not running. For those dogs who never run in the race, they're chained up their whole lives.
You know, there's just 52 teams that are racing in this Iditarod. It's the 47th running of the Iditarod. It's the smallest field in more than 2 decades. Is there like a circuit that these guys go on, or is you do the Iditarod and then you just, hibernate for the rest of the year? Or are there other races that they go to participate with their dogs?
There are other races, such as the Yukon Quest, which is a 1,000-mile race in Alaska. And actually, in last year's Yukon Quest, a dog named Boppy died. This poor dog had seizures for more than 6 hours. And even as he suffered, he was still forced to pull a sled until he choked on his own vomit and died of pneumonia. Actually, just last month, a 5-year-old dog named Joker died in the Yukon Quest, again from choking on his own vomit. So there are other races they do. Dogs continue to suffer and die in those. They also write books. And, interestingly, we read 2 books written by Dallas Seavey and Mitch Seavey. And the Seaveys are kind of considered Iditarod royalty. And we actually have a feature on PETA.org. You can go to PETA.org and read excerpts from these books where they talk about withholding food from the dogs in order to make them super hungry and eat quickly while on the trail. They talk about beating these dogs. They talk about hitting the dogs and doing so you don't get caught. It's pretty eye-opening. And these are in books that they wrote on how to be a musher, how to run the Iditarod.
Right. And so they kind of further romanticize this whole idea. Oh, we are the great outdoorsmen who are also great torturers of dogs, really.
And they say very clearly in their books, these are not pets. They're very open about how these animals are treated. And it's so normal, it's so normal to the practice of dog racing that, to them writing these books, this is just how it is.
After seeing the start, and this is the 47th year, are you getting a sense that PETA has turned a corner, that maybe people are beginning to see the cruelty, or is this a much longer fight still?
We're definitely seeing that the majority of people, and more every year, are opposed to sled dog racing and races like the Iditarod. More and more people, even from inside the mushing community, are coming forward to talk about the abuse that they're witnessing and dogs being killed. More and more, we're seeing sponsors who are pulling their support of the race. So the mushers are really clinging to this, but it's going to go the way of Ringling Brothers and other abusive animal enterprises. And really, there's no need for this race to end. They just need to leave the dogs out of it. They could have willing human participants running the race. They could use snowmobiles. Both of those are things that are done right now. All they need to do is get rid of the dogs.
All right. Colleen O'Brien, thank you very much for your time. And people can check out as the race goes on. There'll be updates on PETA.org, right?
We will keep everyone updated. Yes.
All right. Colleen, thank you for being part of the PETA podcast.
Thank you so much.
Colleen O'Brien, PETA's VP of Communications, on the Iditarod. Get more information and take action on the race. Go to PETA.org. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.